Content warning. This story contains scenes of violence, references to slavery and coercion, and difficult themes. Reader discretion advised. It all happened so fast. By midnight, the house that had kept her whole life in place became a room of decisions, and the rain made everything feel like a verdict. Amelia pressed her hand to the window pane. The glass trembled under the storm's fingers, and the garden beyond was a smear of black and shifting shapes. She could hear her father's boots on the office floor, the quick, clipped voice that belonged to orders and ledgers. He was arranging names like accounts. A viscount from Paraíba do Sul, the ceremony tomorrow at noon, dowry, alliances. Each syllable fell like the pound of a gavel. There was no way to step back from that sentence. The house, its rooms lacquered with portraits and the quiet weight of inherited wealth, was, in a single breath, contracting around her. Where there should have been time to grieve or to argue, her father gave her an appointment. Tomorrow. Noon. The future was reduced to the tilt of a clock hand and the pressure of a signature. She had been slow to measure her own edges. Born beneath the wide roof of the Baron's estate, raised to know every path across the sugar-cane and every tongue of servants who passed through the courtyard, Amelia had learned the language of obedience, as if it were a second skin. But there had always been a small private geography in her life, where commands lost their shape. The back garden by the fountain, under the fig tree that kept seasons in its leaves, the guardhouse where a man moved with a quiet economy of motion, and a poem folded in the cuff of his shirt. Gabriel. To others he was efficient and watchful, a man who knew how to read horses and the shifting moods of overseers. They called him by what he had been, no longer slave, then alforriado, then trusted guard, until the title hung like a question in the passages of the house. To Amelia he was the only person who had taught her to read beyond the textbook sentences of the governess. He brought her scraps of verses, ink smudged on his fingers, handwriting that bent into folded metaphors. When he spoke, it was as if he was placing small luminous things into her hands. A line of Sappho or a Portuguese sonnet, translated into a life they might never have. Their conversations were always a theft. They took place in corners no one examined, the cool base of a statue, the shadow beneath the fig, the servants' corridor right after the midday bell. He taught her to listen for the weather inside people's faces, to find meaning in the ways men left their coats on chairs. Once, in the dry heat of late summer, he had traced the map of a place he called Angra, an open harbour, a chance to be nowhere anyone could name you, and the old man's fishing nets and small, anonymous rooms that did not ask what family you belonged to. Amelia would lie awake afterward, tasting the word Angra as if pronouncing it might make it real. She knew the rules, all of them. She saw with a terrible clarity how her father's markets were stitched to the labour of those who bent beneath the sugar-cane. Luxury had a cost, spelled in calluses and seed-stiff hands, in the quick, watchful eyes that counted for liberty. When her father discussed the marriage in his office, his syllables were all ledgers and advantage, a title that would shore up their influence, an alliance to ward off debts and rumour. He spoke as if Amelia were a ledger item, an addition to the estate's ledger, not a human with a throat that could close with grief. She could imagine the Viscount, old, soft-handed, a man more used to charts than to vigour. She could feel the temperature of his hand on a marriage contract, the thought of being given away like a parcel, of hands not hers fastening the ribbon, sent a foreign animal through her ribcage. Fear, yes, but something sharper. The life they had designed for her was one of appearances and restraint. The Viscount's name meant a life threaded with gilded imprisonment. So when Gabriel tapped at her window that night, and the rain knew neither etiquette nor mercy, she did not choose innocence. She chose in the narrow way that passes for choosing when time slams the door. She accepted. He did not steal her from the house like a thief. He arrived because someone had to refuse the tally her father wrote for her. He stood on the sill, soaked dark hair plastered, a small handkerchief in his fist, his coat heavy with water and scent of smoke and the sea. "There's no time," he said, voice low, the kind of voice that rarely raised itself in front of the porcelain of the drawing rooms. "Tomorrow noon they will bind you with a name and set a sign on your life. I have a way, if you want it." For a moment she did not answer, because the first emotion was protest, the kind formed of impossible attachments. It would not be elegant to flee, it would be dramatic and ruinous, and likely to doom more than her own skin. But the sound of rain made her father's decision seem like a physical force. The house felt sudden and final. She pressed her palm to the fogged glass, felt the cool against the heat of her skin, and knew she had to claim some shape of freedom before they sold her future like a bond. "You cannot," she began, and then she stopped, because to say cannot was already to concede that there was a path laid for her by others. To say yes, rushed yes, was to say she would choose, however quickly. "No time to say no," she whispered, repeating the phrase that would become the axis of half of what followed. But in her mouth the phrase bent. She didn't have time to deliberate. She only had time to decide. Gabriel watched her, not like a rescuer bent in triumph, but like someone calculating every risk in the space of a heartbeat. He took a breath and made her step back from the window. He had prepared for this, with the decisive, spare attention of a man who had learned to survive in a world that measured him by different weights. A sack, small and practical, an oilskin cloak, a threadbare map, the faint scent of tobacco and rosemary that he used to mask his tracks. There was a folded cloth with coins, not many, enough for a bribe and a boatman's patience. "Bring what you can carry," he said without sermon. "Bring the shawl with the blue thread, and the brooch, no questions. The fisher in Angra will take us if we can pay him. I have friends. Ramon at the south gate owes me. Old sailors, men who don't ask where you come from. We leave now, or we do not leave at all." The urgency was not theatre. He had removed the cane that kept an old hunting hut in the forest, a place he claimed to know from boyhood when he had run free for pockets of time that were never fully his. The hut was small and raw but private. He had prepared food that dawn, had watched the clock as if timing a soldier's march. He had recruited 2 men, silent and dark as crows, who had sworn on the small things they loved, loyalty, bread, a promise that they'd walk beside him. They were not many, but they were enough to break the circle. Amelia moved with a speed that surprised her. She stuffed the shawl and the brooch, slipped on a dress that could be folded into a life at sea, and tied her hair simply. There was no time for ceremony. The room was suddenly conspicuously small. She left behind the embroidered pillows and the framed portraits that would forever watch the moment with a silence that felt like accusation. She did not return for the gown that would, in another life, have made her appear considerable in the eyes of the Viscount. She took instead the practical shoes of a governess she had outrun so often. Before she climbed out the window, she looked once at the portrait over her mother's mantel, a woman with her hair braided in a fashion of dignity and decline. The painted eyes watched her, uncomprehending. Amelia did not ask permission. Permission was a currency she could no longer rely upon. They slipped into the rain like 2 figures of ink, dissolving into a larger blur. Gabriel anchored her, not possessively, but with an arm that kept her from tipping into the dark. They did not speak much. Words would have been too many, and too few. The garden was a territory of memory, statues wearing the rain like a veil, the fountain swollen and singing, the fig tree throwing off a perfume of bruised leaves. Dogs barked somewhere in the distance, and were silenced with a murmur from Gabriel. They knew the roots of the land, where the cane dipped low enough to hide 2 bodies, the fence the overseer seldom checked. Every step was a negotiation between speed and caution. At one point, Amelia stumbled, and Gabriel's hand steadied her not with command, but with an unadorned tenderness, the kind one reserves for things one hopes to guard. Their faces were close, their breath made white against the night. In that small proximity, something old and dangerous and necessary unspooled between them. The confession that had been avoided, the hunger of 2 people who had learned what being nameless could mean. They moved through corridors of cane and into the shadow of the wood. The rain softened to a mist that clung to their clothes. Gabriel's plan was a lattice of quiet deals, a fisherman near the cove who took on passengers for a price, a brother of a man in the Quilombo who could offer them shelter if things went wrong. He had made promises to men who had bled for lesser causes. He had accrued in small payments and favors a network that was not generous, but was, in the end, practical. The hunted always has one advantage: momentum. For those who must choose suddenly, momentum replaces deliberation. They left behind 1,000,000 small comforts, new gowns, the surety of patrimony, the woven certainties of social respect, and moved forward toward a thin possibility, to be someone else in a place that did not hold them by a title. As they approached the edge of the estate, Gabriel paused, fingers tracing the cut of a path he knew by heart. "We must keep to the stream," he said. "They watch the roads more than the water lines. If dogs pick our scent, we go deeper into the jungle. Ramon will be at the old mill, 6 paces past the leaning palm. He knows our sign." Amélia swallowed the sound of her lungs. Her throat worked, not because she was cold, but because the scale of what she had done was only then beginning to reveal itself. There was terror, a raw animal fear that the gate would open and the whole plan collapse into the iron clarity of her father's voice. But there was also something like relief, an odd levity that came from choosing a path that, although dangerous, was hers. They reached the low stone wall that refused to be more than a suggestion of boundary. Gabriel climbed first, and then lent a small hand. Amélia felt the scrape of rough stone against the palm of her hand. It was grounding, and for a moment she thought she would laugh at the absurd specificity of it. They slipped into shadow. Near the leaning palm, the mill's wheel whispered in the dark. Ramon waited with his own rain-dark back turned. He gave them a quick nod, and a sleeve of bread and a small flask passed between weathered hands. "You should not be here," he said in a voice that was half reproach and half wonder. "The Baron's men are fevered like dogs tonight. Keep low. The boat leaves after dawn, if the sea favors us." "We leave now," Gabriel said. There was no defiance. There was a plan, sharpened like a blade. They moved together toward the hunting hut. It was, as Gabriel had promised, a crude box of wood and smoke. Everything inside smelled of dried meat and tar. He had set a small pallet and a brazier. When Gabriel closed the door, the world outside seemed to compress into the thickness of the plank. Inside, the hut held a different kind of intimacy, the hush of someone who had prepared for the possibility that life would demand choices and had not wasted time in drama. Amélia unwrapped her shawl and let the warmth of the small fire press against the cold that had clung to her. Gabriel moved with the steady motions of a caretaker, more used to tending wounds and horses than to making conversation. He cut a strip of bread and offered it to her. She took it with fingers that still trembled. "You did not have to do this," she said, tasting bread and something like apology. "You could have walked away. Men like you are punished for less." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "Someone had to choose," he said simply. "Someone had to refuse what your father decided was sale and settlement. It is not courage to leave a life intact. It is courage to make a choice when there is little time to think." He did not flatter. He spoke as a man who had known loss and had learned how to be precise with what he could give. They slept in the same air that night, but not on the same pallet at first. The hut was a geography of small provinces, the brazier, the pallet, a trunk that held the few things Gabriel had kept. He remained watchful at the door for long stretches, while Amélia dozed in fits and starts, the adrenaline of flight giving way to the exhaustion of someone who had finally allowed her spine to uncoil. In the grey hours before dawn, when rain receded into a soft ache on the roof, Amélia woke to find Gabriel close enough that she could hear the slow pattern of his breath. There was a vulnerability in that closeness that had nothing to do with convenience. It was the sort of revelation that arrives when two people survive something together. They did not declare their love with phrases from the code of salon novels. Instead, they shared smaller things. The way a thumb traced the inside of a wrist, a hand held steady under a fevered forehead, a single kiss that held the promise of consent and the weight of consequence. The kiss was not a surrender to lust but a chosen alliance, made in the knowledge of what lay ahead. It was hurried, yes, because the world beyond the hut demanded haste, but it carried with it an agreement between two adults who took stock of what they wanted and reached for it. Morning came soft and grey. They did not linger in the hut's false safety. Gabriel had arranged for them to meet a fisherman who would move them toward the south, toward a boat that would take them along the coast to Angra. But morning also brought news. The overseer's patrol had discovered a missing dress on the neighbor's fence, 2 footprints in the mud that might match the patterns of a search. The Baron's men had a way of measuring outrage and placing a bounty on it. People with little to lose could make a tiny fortune on the misfortune of those who fled. They gathered their meager belongings and moved on, the woodland offering an uneasy sanctuary. The world, when they left the hut, felt both nearer and vaster than the house that had nearly claimed Amélia. The forest was a cathedral of dripping leaves and rooted pathways. Gabriel's eyes were always moving, cataloguing the sound of a branch snapping into the probable presence of a patrol. He had a map in his head of creek beds and hidden footpaths, of the times when a river's current would carry a scent away, and of the hours when the tide left the shore exposed and dangerous. On the third day they reached a shallow river that would, if they kept its course, lead them to a coastal path where the fisherfolk would meet them. Hunger and fever had settled into Amélia with the relentlessness of a tide. Each night she slept fitfully, and each morning the ache in her muscles refused to ease. Gabriel sat at the river's lip and stripped apples from a bag, offering one to her with a gentleness that had the weight of a benediction. "You should not be so brave alone," she told him, tasting the apple and thinking of the Viscount and the office and the signature. "You were brave enough for both of us." He smiled in a way that was not dismissive. "Bravery is not a single man's burden," he said. "It is the accumulation of small favors and a refusal to let the past be the only law." They kept walking. The built world of the Baron, its roads and its watchtowers, slid away, and with that slippage, the peculiar clarity of being unknown grew heavier and brighter. To be uncounted was to be at risk, but it was also to be fertile ground for reinvention. Talk of Angra grew into plans of Montevideo, into scaffolding that could be erected with patience and trade. Amélia and Gabriel spoke in half-formed essays about the kind of life they might attempt to build. A small shop, where the smell of coffee could come through a window, a room with a narrow balcony and a plant in a pot, children who would not know the legerd logic of her father's house. But a story that begins with rain and a stolen night is rarely free of retribution. On the sixth evening, as they crested a small ridge and could see the slate band of the sea against a pale horizon, the sound of dogs carried to them. Gabriel froze. The landscape before them, coastal scrub and scattered palms, suddenly seemed all border and trap. The dogs barked a long rising note, and the human voices that answered them were the precise kind Gabriel had hoped to avoid. "Down!" he hissed. They flattened themselves into a trough of earth and roots. Amélia felt the sting of grit in her lips, the scrape of a twig against her cheek. Her heart thudded in a rhythm that made the world two things at once, immediate terror and a slow, limitless possibility. The dogs came nearer, noses down. The voices were muffled and bright like flint. Men moved through the brush, patrolmen perhaps, or overseers with the state's impatience for recovery. For a moment, Gabriel's hand found Amelia's where it rested on the moss. He tightened his grip, not as an owner but as a protector. In that small connection, a communication. Be silent, breathe, trust. The dogs passed 3 paces from them, yawning breaths over damp hair. Amélia wanted to scream, wanted to rise and run and be reckless, but she stayed because Gabriel's hand was a compass. They waited until the voices receded, a line of sound swallowed by the rustle of palms. Only then did they allow themselves to unclench, to move in a pace that was more prayer than stride. Later, at a fisherman's hut that smelled of dried fish and old rope, they were met by a man called Joachim. He was lean and sun-scarred, with a face that knew the price of silence and the value of a pair of coins that told of a new life. He took Amelia's brooch and fingered it as if reading the story in its metal. It would be their fare, he said, and the brooch would feed his family the week they reached Angra. "Heavy things are called to heavy hands," he muttered, and there was no cruelty in it, only the economy of a man who had no illusions about the world's balances. The barter was quick and practical. Amélia felt the loss of the brooch like a stitch being pulled. It was a family relic, a small inheritance from a mother whose portrait watched the empty pillowcases. But this transaction was an exchange for motion. The brooch paid for a place on Joachim's sloop, and the patience of a crew that would not ask too many questions. The sail on the boat felt foreign beneath Amelia's knees, and the sea's motion made her dizzy with possibility. She kept her gaze on the expanse, fingers laced with Gabriel's sometimes, letting the rhythm of the waves become a new language of steadiness. They left the coast under low sky, and the land receded into a matte smear. The nights at sea were filled with small intimacies. A hand warmed against another, a whisper of future plans, a routine of calls between sailors who had known each other long enough to be mute companions. On the second night aboard Joachim's sloop, the rain returned, but this time it was softer, as if the sea itself were weeping for something it had lost and could not name. Amelia fell ill with a fever that brought sheened visions and a delirium of her mother's eyes, of clean sheets and the small maddening way the Viscount's name stuck to everything. Gabriel sat up with her for long stretches, wet cloth at her brow, murmuring the lines of poems he had once taught her. He read to her because his voice steadied reality. It kept the fever from sliding into something harsher. "Stay with me," she said painfully one time, breath quick, fingers caught in his sleeve. "If you go, if you leave, what becomes of me?" He answered not with promises but with a small commitment. "I will be where you are," he said, as if that phrase were an oath. "I will carry the day you cannot. You will have to carry me too sometimes." The fever came and went. When the ship at last slid into the loose harbour of Angra, the sight of the quay was a resurrection. Slabs of wood, men who worked by the cold certainty of tides, the smell of salt and smoke and future. They paid again for a lift along the coast, some of the crew idealizing Montevideo the way pilgrims idealize a distant holy place. It was not paradise, it was merely a place where a different set of forces pressed upon people. For two people who had fled the leged certainties of an estate, it was as good a world as any to try on. But escape always has a ledger of its own. At the quay, as they gathered themselves to step toward a smaller boat that would carry them further down the coast, a shape in the crowd tightened the air, men in the Baron's livery. They had been precise as vultures. They had the terrible patience of those who have been unpaid for too long. A shout broke the air. Amelia did not need to look to know who had made it. The Baron's presence, even if borne by others, was a pressure shaped like a hand. "You cannot run from your blood," someone said, and the words were a blade. The sound of the Baron's voice itself did not need to travel. His will did. It had summoned captains of the Mato and men with short knives who lived by chasing ghosts. A hand fell to a pistol's grip, a quick animal movement. Gabriel stepped in front of Amelia without thinking of the consequence. He had a way of moving as if cleaving air into safe passage for those he chose to save. The quarrel that began was not cinematic in the way novels prefer. There were no duels at dawn, but instead a messy scuffle, a shout, the brittle cracking of a struggle. Gabriel was not without skill. His body had been used to hard work and sharper fights. He fought as if calibrating each move to protect a single person and to avoid killing if he could. A shot cracked, more noise than purpose, and someone fell. Men shouted, the boat rocked with movement, and the decision that had been a hush became a public performance. There was a choice to do harm and a choice to refuse. Gabriel, despite his hurt, did not take a life that night. He could have. Skill and desperation sometimes make murder plausible, but he refused to be the kind of man who became what he despised. That refusal almost cost them everything. It marked him with a wound that bled and a conscience that would not let him sleep easily. They forced Gabriel into the boat with a wound that would not be trivial, and the pair leapt as the tide accepted them. As the quay slipped away behind them, Amelia watched the Baron's men shrink into a smear of coats and yells. There was relief, yes, but it tasted of iron. Gabriel's hand was warm but weak against her fingers. He had bled, not only physically, but with the heavy certainty that in sparing another man's life he had bought them both a debt. That debt would follow them like a shadow. They found refuge in a cabin at the bay's edge, a small room above a boathouse that smelled of oil and old rope. The night after the scuffle, Gabriel tended his wound and slept fitfully. Amelia, sitting at his side, felt the weight of what they had done settle and thicken into something that might be called consequence. She watched him sleep and wondered, with the puzzled self-knowledge of someone who had once checked the reflection in a window to make sure she still belonged to the world, whether their choice had indeed been a move toward better breathing or toward an exile of hunger and risk. He woke with the same dawn that seemed to float differently in this new place. He touched the bandage at his side with the thumb of a man who knew how to bear pain without complaint. When he looked at Amelia, his gaze was both tenderness and a ledger of things unspoken. "We will go to Montevideo," he said quietly, the city name a scaffold for the life they dreamed of. We will be small. We will build a place where your children do not have to measure themselves on a ledger." She nodded. The image of children, little faces with uncounted futures, slipped into her chest and softened the corners of her fear. There was, in that softening, the birth of another kind of life, one that would accept less comfort for a larger freedom. She thought about the portrait on her mother's wall and felt, for the first time, an understanding of what it meant to choose a life that might earn memory, not by title, but by love. They did not yet know the price Montevideo would demand, or the ghosts the Baron could not forget. They did not yet know the small cruelties of exile, how neighbors could be kind and suspicious, how languages in a new port could shift the shape of a name. What they had that morning was each other, and a horizon unclenched by the proportions of a ledger. They pushed off into the light that promised movement and kept watch for the sign of new life at the waterline. And when, on the far edge of the harbour, the form of a small sail cut through the dawn, Amelia understood what it meant to have acted in a single breath, that a life could be shaped by the slimmest of chances, and that the consequences of choosing quickly were at once ruinous and salvational. She held Gabriel's hand as the boat nudged away, and in the slow retreat of shore she whispered, almost to herself and almost to the world, "If this is how freedom tastes, bitter and bright, then let us become its apprentices." The boat moved like a thought across the dark water, slow, stubborn, unwilling to be hurried by the shore's noise. Amelia kept her knuckles pale around the rail, while the town dissolved behind them into a smear of lamps and shouting, a place where her name could be called and where voices could place a price on a life. Here the wind had a different grammar. It spoke of distance and of other people's weather. She let it take the damp from her hair and found for a moment that the sound of the sea made fear less sharp. It is easier to bear fear when it has room. If you love period dramas with real stakes and characters who choose hard things, like this video and stay with the story. Joachim's sloop slid along sheltered channels for the better part of a day, its thin sail a ragged white against a sky that never quite committed to blue. The crew were steady-eyed men who had learned how to look without prying. They asked only for coin and for silence. The brooch had bought more than a berth. It had bought discretion, the kind that comes with a trade. On board, nights were cold and long. Gabriel tended his wound with a thin bandage, and the patient, exact ministrations of a man who had once known how to bind beasts as well as men. The cut, when it was fresh, had bled with the taste of iron and the memory of a hand on a pistol. It left a searing ache under ribs that sometimes took his breath in the middle of the day. Amelia boiled herbs in a small tin and laid them against his side. She read aloud the poems he had taught her because sounds seemed to hold the world together when bodies were fragile. "You saved me at the quay," she said one night, when the sea had folded into a low, steady drum and the crew snored like overturned beasts. "Not by killing, by being something else." He smiled, slow, a thing that felt like a ledger finally balanced for reasons that weren't about money. "Sometimes not killing is the only way to keep a shape of yourself," he answered. "I would rather be wounded and live than be a man haunted by a hand that did what he'd learned to despise." They dreamed in the small items of freedom. A shop with a window, a plant on a sill, a cook stove that always kept a pot on. Those dreams were fragile, paper things rolled against waves, but they were their own. Amelia remembered the name Montevideo like it was a small prayer, something she could say and watch a town of possibility answer back. Arriving at Montevideo was a kind of unformation. Buildings stood without the same deliberate weight as her father's house. They were a jumble of newness and necessity, painted in colours that had not known the slow varnish of aristocratic patience. The port smelled of coffee and guano and coal. Languages rubbed against one another like hands in a crowd. Here, a woman could be a seamstress one day, and a shopkeeper the next, depending on the size of a customer's purse. Here, the idea of being counted by birth felt distant, though not absent, and that distance was the air they breathed. They took a small room over a bakery, windows that opened to a street where children chased hoops and where people hawked citrus and bread. The room was high and narrow, and the floorboards sighed when one walked. It was not a stately apartment, but it was theirs, if one could call anything in this life truly owned. They paid for their first week with what remained of Joachim's coin. Gabriel found work hauling sacks at the docks, his body answering to labour with an uncomplaining fidelity. Amélia sewed by the window, repairing coats and hemming sleeves for sailors who paid with small laughs and kinder glances. Montevideo demanded learning and gave it in return. The city taught them how works were done without servants to insist upon it. Gabriel learned to bargain for bread. Amélia learned to mend and to hide bruises with a smile. When she spoke of the house she had left, she often watched Gabriel's face and saw not pity, but a kind of clear-eyed understanding. Both of them had been shaped by other people's hands. Both had chosen in different ways to refuse that shaping. Months passed with the accumulation of small victories. Gabriel's wound hardened into a pale line. They began to trade with a firmness that was neither romance nor convenience, but the daily economy of staying alive. Amélia bartered needlework for lessons in arithmetic from a bookbinder named Marta, a woman with a sharp voice and quicker sympathy. Marta knew how to disregard questions. She had once been married to a man who thought a woman's value was measured in dowries. She taught Amélia to keep both needles and accounts. In the market, Amélia discovered a talent for noticing what people needed before they asked. A mother reached for a child's torn sleeve. Amélia had the thread and the polite phrase. She found that skill turned customers into regulars, and regulars into a small shape of community. Gabriel would come home with pockets full of small coins and the stories of the docks, a shipment delayed for 2 days, a storm that had broken nets, a man who had jumped into the water and was saved by a waiter who had been drunk. They met other fugitives, people who arrived with names like scars and with histories folded into their backs. There was an older woman, Teresa, who sold roasted chestnuts on a corner and who spoke the language of the Quilombos with a fondness that made Amélia sit and listen. Teresa had been a midwife during the long removals and had the warmth of someone who had seen birth and survived it too. She wore a ring of bone beads that clacked when she laughed. She became the first person in the city who asked questions without requiring answers, who gave bread and advice in equal measure. The community that gathered around their bakery window room was small but true. There was a seamstress, Rosa, who remembered the smell of sugarcane and who had fled a neighboring plantation with 3 children in tow. There was Manuel, a former sailor who had been pressed into service and found himself again in the city's muddled freedom. These people offered more than coin. They offered the particular solidarity of those who had once been counted as property and now learned the vocabulary of being persons. Rosa's lightness was not frivolity. She carried the memory of the moment she left in the way some carry a wound. It shaped her, but did not define her. She taught Amélia the quiet arts of survival, which officials might be bribed by a loaf of bread, which houses kept watch for strangers, how to cultivate neighbors without inviting prying. In the weeks that became months, Rosa and Teresa were the kind of friends who gave what the big histories rarely mention, a place to leave your head at night and not have it be catalogued. One spring morning, a boy with sticks of sugarcane for sale knocked at their door with a face too old for his years. He had a rumor in his mouth before the first breath. The Baron had died. The news came like a thing that felt like permission and not. For a few hours Amélia imagined the house with the space emptied of its most terrifying voice. Letters would be executed, ledgers revised. But then another voice reached her ears. The Baron's estate would be messy with claimants. The title would move as it does in ledgers, hands changing for reasons of debt and favor, and the coercive structures that had made the Baron's will had not died with him. Slavery, they both knew, did not vanish because one man took a last breath. The world was more complicated than the neat arithmetic of revenge or restitution. Meanwhile, money was slow to arrive for anything except the small demanding necessities. There were weeks of hunger and nights where both lay awake listening to the creaks of the building as if the house itself might betray them. Amelia's waiting meant more than having patience. It became an apprenticeship in endurance. When she bore their first child 9 months after the key incident, it was Teresa who delivered. A steady pair of hands, a bowl of steam, a chord of song. The baby was a boy. They named him Miguel, because the name had been one Amélia had heard once in a poem, and because it felt like a small defiance to give a child a simple, holy name in a world that hoarded names. The first weeks with Miguel were dense and holy. He slept like a half-closed thing, small lungs learning how to hold breath. Gabriel would wake in the night to hold him, whispering lines of the poems he had once smuggled to Amelia. Amelia watched them and felt the force of the life she had chosen, a life that would teach a child the value of being counted as a person and not as a ledger. There was a tenderness in the house that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with care. But new life often opens old doors. Word in a port city is a kind of living thing. It moves on ropes and gossip alike. A man with a taste for recognition and a memory of the quarrel at the quay arrived in Montevideo with the sort of face that is patient for opportunities. He was a small-time informer who had once fought for the Baron's men and who recognized Gabriel from the scuffle. He moved like a grey shadow around docks and taverns, and silence is never a guarantor of safety for those who have enemies willing to trade coin for favor. One evening, when the winter had made the streets thin and the baker's smoke drew like a curtain over windows, the informer put his hand on Gabriel's arm. He had been watching. He had a ledger of his own, names, days, payoffs. "You should look to move," he said in a voice that smelled of vinegar and old wood. "There are men who remember. There are men who like to settle accounts." Gabriel considered him, measured him in the same way he once measured a horse's gait. "What do you want?" he asked. "The price of forgetting," the man said. He wanted what men who profit from pain always want: to be paid by someone who had lost everything to the system and now might be cornered enough to pay it. But Montevideo, for all its promises, did not have the kind of justice that belongs to people of no consequence. It had rules and compromises and a kind of weary mercy bought by coin. They smiled politely and refused. They had no coin for such purchases. The decision made the informer frown, and the frown made him think of how he might make coin in other, darker ways. Throughout that winter, small intolerances accumulated, threatening notes left at the bakery door. A pair of boots found by the river with the impression of a tread that matched a boot they'd once seen on the Baron's men. These were not full-scale assaults, but they were the weather that comes before storms. Then came the day when the informer did what such men often do. He turned rumor into action. He shouted in a dockside tavern that Gabriel was a fugitive, that he had fled with a woman of the Baron's house. Men leaned forward for a story. The tavern's owner made the choice many owners make. Some accounts are worth more than customers. Word traveled toward the authorities. A squad came, late and overconfident, sent by those who preferred to wring trouble out of fear rather than to fix it. They came to the bakery at dawn, boots crisp on the cobble. They asked questions. They smelled like triumph. Amelia was weaving cloth when they arrived. She had a day's sleep in her eyes and Miguel in a sling against her chest. Gabriel was at the docks. The men were polite in a way that had the teeth of a trap. They asked for a man who matched such and such. Amelia felt her voice steady like a practiced seamstress. There was a lesson in keeping calm. Haste makes the household fray. She smiled and said what she needed to say, nothing more and nothing less. Teresa arrived with two neighbors who would later remember, for reasons they could not yet name, the time when small courtesies became shields. The officers did not find Gabriel that day. It was luck and the slow mercy of friends. The informer fumed, and that fume was a lantern that lit uglier paths. He began to gather men who liked the smell of finding trouble. The couple knew, with the sharpness of people who had been chased before, that they needed a plan. To leave again would be to let the past always set the terms of their life. To stay would be to risk the cost of being hunted in a city that was, in truth, new to them. Community answered. Manuel and Rosa organized a small watch. Teresa and Marta spread rumor through markets that Gabriel was ill, that he had fled by sea. People who were rarely generous found themselves offering what they could spare: food, a corner to hide, work that made men appear elsewhere. A pattern emerged. Solidarity is often the sum of many small lies told to protect a few lives. When the informer organized a raid with a group of men and smugglers, and the kind of petty violence that predatory men can manage, Gabriel chose a different kind of plan. He would not be drawn into killing for the sake of a ledger. He called his friends together and explained in the same level tone he had used when they first fled that they would move quietly that night. They would go to the inland villages north of the city, where the government's hand was thinner and where the quilombos had reached through kin and marriage. Ramon, who had waited by the mill for them long ago and who had a face marked with river time, offered a canoe and a forged note. Joachim, who had once sold them a passage and then a story to themselves, came to the docks with a head bowed in apology. "I did what I had to," he told Amélia, handing over a coin and a little leather sachet with dried figs. "I sold the brooch. I have paid for my part. If there is anything left I can do—" "For you have given us life," Amélia said, and the gratitude was not small calloused words but a recognition of the economy of desperate men. Joachim's eyes filled with something like rain. "Do not try to balance a ledger with guilt. Live." They left that night, slipping behind a wall and into the brush, the city receding to stippled light. The escape was not cinematic. It was a set of small, urgent movements, a cart with hay, a loaned horse, the careful shifting of identities. The informer discovered their absence and screamed his complaint into the morning. The city had its routine of indignation and then of another day's work. In the north, the landscape changed into a country of generous trees and backroads. The Quilombos received them not as curiosities, but as kin by history. There, one met the deep, patient knowledge of people who had built lives in the cracks of a cruel system. They taught Gabriel how to sleep with his back against a stump and how to read the patterns of birds as if they were letters. They fed them yams and sang songs that stitched the heart back together. In the Quilombo, Amélia learned new languages of cooking and work and of memory. She learned stories of women who had left plantations before her and of the ways they had kept records of birthdays and names, little acts of defiance that turned into history. They stayed a season in the hills, and during those months Gabriel taught local boys to read in the thin light of the evening. Amélia embroidered a piece that would one day be used as a christening cloth for Miguel. She learned to knead bread in a mortar the size of a small life, and to speak with elders about land and survival. The world slowed, and in the slowing, new possibilities entered the grain of their days. Yet the past is often negotiable but rarely gone. There came a night when drums sounded at the edge of their refuge, a rhythmic call that had been a warning in another life. It was not the Baron's men this time, but a group of bounty seekers sent by those who had a taste for payment and recognition. They came hungry for news, their boots loud on the hard ground. The Quilombo's leaders convened a council beneath a baobab tree, a meeting of long memory and short tempers. There was talk of hiding deeper, of moving across the river, of splitting families and of the cost of such decisions. Rosa, always quick and brave in small ways, proposed a plan. "We will make them look where the path is easy, toward the floodplain. They will go and find only old tracks and mud." She looked at Amélia and Gabriel, and in her eyes there was a fierceness that had cost her more than most. "I will lead them there." It was not a boast. It was a promise that could be kept with small theatre and with danger. Rosa walked through the camp the following morning as if she had business in the lowlands. She was stopped by men who were eager for a prize. She offered them the performance they sought, loud stories, a pretend carelessness. She led them down the route they expected, a path that opened into an endless mudflat at low tide. By the time they realized the mistake, Rosa had returned to the camp breathless but unhurt. She had given them a day. The cost of that day was heavy. The leader of the bounty seekers sulked and remodeled his anger into a burning desire to prove himself. On the third night after Rosa's misdirection, men came closer than they had before and camped at the edge of the community with a brazier and loud voices that mocked the place's quiet. No one wanted another fight. No one wanted blood spilled. Her stand was made of silence and of the refusal to be easily caged. The biggest dangers, in the end, were not always those that flashed. They were the quiet compromises, paying a small tribute to a local official, bending a rule that later becomes a habit. The group decided to move once more, this time to a town where anonymity was less of a luxury and more of a necessary survival. They traveled slowly along the river, carrying their memories like bread. Years laid over years. Miguel grew, first in the softness of his mother's lap, and then into the sturdy legs of a boy who learned to run on other people's roofs and to count coins. Amélia bore 2 more children, a daughter months after Miguel's 3rd birthday and another years later. They named the eldest daughter Teresa, after the midwife who had delivered Miguel, and who taught Amélia that naming could be a gift, and the youngest, Anna, for a woman who had given Amélia a pot when they had nothing, and said, "Cook and remember me kindly." Montevideo began to feel less like a place one hid from, and more like one they built in small, stubborn increments. Gabriel took a job with a crew that repaired nets for a fishing company. His hands became the same kind of precise as they had once been with horses and with binding wounds. Amelia opened a tiny stall in the market, where she sold stitched garments and mended socks. They lived an unornamented life. Bread, working hands, laughter that came at odd times, tears that were not always announced. Their children learned to listen before they spoke, and to ask questions that were steady rather than accusatory. The years did not erase the ledger. There were times when the memory of the Baron's house pressed against Amelia's chest like an old portrait leaned too long against a wall. There were letters, late and polite, from distant kin representing a world that no longer fit her. An uncle died and left a small curiosity of inheritance, and a lawyer wrote with the coldness of paper to say that some matters were settled and some weren't. The Baron's death, when the news finally reached them in a more formal way, an announcement in a ragged newspaper, registered for Amelia as a footnote rather than a liberation. She had learned that structures do not dissolve with the breath of a single man. They change slowly like the bend of a river. But something else shifted in time. Children learn different things than their parents, and the children of the bakery window room learned not the ledger's language but another, the value of effort, the right to choose. Miguel grew into a young man who loved the sea and numbers both. He worked as an apprentice with a shipping clerk and learned to read manifests and to keep accounts honestly. Teresa loved plants and the way they demanded patience. She tended a small pot on the sill that became for the family a green proof of survival. Ana liked stories and would sit for hours at Teresa's side, listening to tales of figs and mills and of the little heroic acts that stitched a day together. One afternoon a letter came, folded with the formal air of a world that kept neat records. It announced without malice or triumph that the Baron's estate had been partitioned and that certain claims had been settled. There was an offer in the envelope, the return of a small parcel of land under certain legal conditions. The letter asked whether Amelia would press for a claim. Return to the house? Reclaim a name? The possibilities were not uncomplicated. To accept would be to buy a reinsertion into a system that had once measured people as things. To refuse would be to close a door that could provide economic security. They met at night and argued, with the tiredness of people who had already chosen the difficult path. Gabriel said nothing heroic. He said, with the quiet arithmetic of a man who has learned to count his obligations, that whatever they did should be decided by the children who would inherit the consequences. The children, in their small and fierce way, said that the world could be negotiated in many maps. In the end, they chose differently. They filed papers to reject the return, refusing to be pulled back into a life where names were titles to be traded. Instead, they sought a claim in the city, a small shopfront registered in Amelia's name, that could be passed to her children. It was a choice that refused both erasure and blind revenge. It was not a grand moral. It was a deliberate and practical one, a refusal to let an old system rewrite their lives. It was the kind of decision that made history at the scale of a family and not at the scale of parliaments. Years later, on a morning when Miguel was old enough to keep the shop open and Teresa had a small garden in the back alley, they received the news of the Baron's final death in a way that had neither joy nor malice. The world was complicated, and so were its endings. Amelia heard the words and let them pass like wind through the fig tree that was now a memory of a tree back home. The news did not undo what had been done. It registered only as a point in time, the sort of punctuation historians find convenient. On the evening of Miguel's wedding, small, quiet, with cake instead of a feast, Amelia sat back and watched their children, friends, and neighbors. Gabriel stood beside her, with the resilience of someone who had chosen to be kind even when the world demanded cruelty. Their life had been threaded with sacrifice. Rosa's cunning and risk, Teresa's steady hands, Joaquim's belated atonement, but also with the ordinary acts of building, taking in a seamstress's work, teaching a neighbor's child to read, being at someone's door in the night because there is no other currency as binding as presence. Amelia sometimes thought about that night, when the rain had been heavy and the house had closed around her like a fist. She remembered the tilt of the clock hand, the suddenness that forced a choice. It all happened so fast, she would tell people when they asked. But then she would add what she had learned. Speed is not always an absence of agency. Sometimes it is the pressure that forces clarity. There are choices we make in the space of a single breath, and choices we make across years. Both make us who we are. As the light faded on Miguel's wedding day, and the children danced on cobbles, Amelia walked to the small window that looked onto the street. Gabriel joined her and took her hand the way he had on so many nights, with steady fingers, a thumb that kept time like a small metronome. "Would you do it again?" she asked, not wanting to romanticize and not wanting to deny the cost. Gabriel leaned against the frame and looked out at the flicker of lamplight. "I would," he said, "because we chose. Even when we had no time to wonder, we chose, and that made all the difference." Amelia's laugh was soft, and not without the small ache of memory. She reached into her pocket and touched the place where a small scrap of silk had once been, an echo of the brooch's shine. It was a reminder of debts paid and debts forgiven in ways that did not demand ledger balance. They made a life that was not safe in the old sense, but was in a new sense enough. Their children learned that names are not always labels of property, and that a life can be purchased in the currency of courage and care. The story they left their children was not a legend of heroics. It was a set of instructions by example. Speak plainly. Take risks when they are necessary. Protect those who cannot protect themselves, and refuse to become the people your enemies would hope you'd be. Years later, after white had touched both their hair, Amelia sat with a shawl over her knees and watched Anna braid Teresa's child's hair. She thought of the house from where she had fled, and of the portrait that had once watched her go. She felt no regret that she had left. Regret is a bitter currency. She preferred gratitude for the small, patient things that had been given in exchange. "It all happened so fast," she said to Gabriel once more, a confession and a kind of benediction. But choosing in a breath, choosing to love and to run and to be together, stretched across a life. It was the first moment that made us who we have become. He took her hand and did not speak. Words were not always needed. Their life, ragged, stubborn, full of small songs, was proof enough. Would you risk everything for love and freedom? Tell us in the comments below and subscribe for more stories that ask the hard questions about choice, courage, and the lives we carve out in the wake of other people's decisions.